This is the second half of our study of Numbers, and it's going to travel or cover from the trip around Edom to the plague of serpents and the death of Aaron, the account of Balaam, and the eventual sin with Moab that would really be the big one, that straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, that God says, no, you're not going to do that. But it turns out that Jesus is going to use that the plague as a example of what he himself would come to do. So as Israel continues to travel, Moses sends messengers ahead to the king of Edom to request passage through his land, but he refuses to allow it. And while nothing more is said about it in the chapter 20 of Numbers, later on this refusal will be a factor in God's judgments against them and all Israel's enemies. So right now it's just something to note in passing, and just to recall to mind when later studies will come up on these people of Edom and why God has a problem with them. So they go around, and it's after that that God says that Aaron's life is about to end. And before we go on to that, you can see also that this is, the comments that Constable has on all this. But before Aaron goes, he needs to pass on his priestly office to his son. And they go up on this mountain. I don't know if I have the right page up here yet. I think I've gone a little bit past it. Sorry about that. They have this little ceremony, and they go up on the mountain where everyone can see. He passes, give his garments and everything to his son, and then he passes away, and I think he's buried there on that mountain, on Mount Hor. So then 66 here is where we'll see about they have a victory over this Canaanite city of Hormah, and Israel, though, gets impatient, having to go around Edom, who, like we said, they didn't get permission, so they had to go around, and they're getting impatient, and they decide this is a good time to whine about free food from heaven. They don't like it anymore. They're sick of it. It's boring. So God wastes no time in punishing them, in this case with poisonous serpents. And a lot of them are killed. I forget how many thousand, but the solution after they repent is for Moses to make a bronze likeness of one of the snakes and put it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at it in faith will be healed if they're bitten. And this is precisely what Jesus referred to in John 3:14, when he said that he too would be lifted up, and whoever looks at him in faith is saved. And as always, God has reasons for what he does and commands, and he's not obligated to explain every one of them to us as we often demand. And really, none of us are any better than Israel when it comes to forgetting what God has done for us and how many times he's forgiven us. But we can see here that this is another one of those things to keep in mind when we read later passages, especially as I just mentioned about the New Testament, where Jesus said that this is the way people would be saved, by looking to him in faith. It isn't something they had to do other than trust that God has a solution for their problem, and it's really simple. It doesn't require a whole lot from them, just to believe, and they would be healed. And so that's what he's talking about in John 3:14, about being lifted up. So let's go on then to page 69 on his notes here, and we're into chapter 21. So Israel has gone on from this incident where a lot of them were killed by the snakes, and then you can see here that there's a map of the various people groups in Canaan, with the strongest being the Amorites. They have them highlighted here in this area. Here's the Mediterranean Sea over here. Here's the Jordan River. Here's where the Ammonites were. And chapter 21 is where we meet this king named Og, king of Bashan, and they defeat him after they defeat the Amorites. And there's going to be more about Og in Deuteronomy 3, where he is described as a Rephaite, a giant, if we remember that from the study of Genesis. Not all the Nephilim were giant size. They were all superhuman in strength and power, but the Rephaites were also giant sizes. So that's who this King Og of Bashan was. But they defeated him. But Deuteronomy, as I mentioned, will backtrack and go over some more of these things. So let's go on to page 72. Sorry about all the scrolling. Sometimes it's easier than typing it in. We come to the account of Balaam. And as Constable notes here, commentators are divided over whether or not Balaam was a prophet of God. So they're not sure. First they set up the backdrop of all these things, and they can't decide whether he's good or bad. But the thing is that I personally believe that he was probably not a prophet of God, but he still appeared to know about God, the God of Israel, and had some kind of respectful fear of him. He was at least an influential and sought-after soothsayer, and what he was about to experience would certainly, you would think, make him reconsider his view of the supernatural, because apparently he had some kind of special ability or skill in getting the so-called gods, the demons really, to do his bidding. And so that's why he was famous in the area. There are a lot of extra biblical accounts of him as a soothsayer that kings especially would seek out, and because he would require payment, and so they would offer him whatever he wanted to do, defeat armies and so forth, or whatever it was they needed. Now it turns out that Balaam at first simply accepts God's command not to go with these officials from Moab who have come to ask him to defeat Israel, who is in the area, and they're afraid of them, so they want this famous soothsayer to take care of the problem. But God tells him, even though he wasn't one of his prophets, he tells him not to go. No, no cursing Israel. But King Balak decides, well, I'll just sweeten the deal, and Balaam waits for God's answer again, but not that he really considered, they'll use the phrase, my God, but the God he's dealing with at the time is probably a better meaning if you look at all the context. But he waits for an answer from this God, and this time God says, go ahead, but you still can't curse them. So God has his reasons for sending him. It's kind of a back and forth thing where God's like, what are you doing? And then Balaam's like, well, you told me I could go. And then he's like, I know what you're going to do. And so, again, God's ways are not our ways, but this is what we have to deal with in the text. So God gets upset, like I mentioned, and it seems to me that the best solution for that, for why God would say, go ahead, and then say, why did you go, is that he was testing Balaam to see if he would make the right decision and decide not to go on his own. Even though God gave him permission, didn't mean that's necessarily what God wanted. So this is where we come to the incidents of his donkey talking to him. And I think I might have gone a little bit ahead, I'm not sure, but apparently the donkey sees the angel, not apparently, but actually sees an angel of the Lord blocking the path. And again, we don't know whether this is a manifestation of Jesus or whether it's just an angel, but seems to be the angel of the Lord by the description. Standing there holding a drawn sword, and so the donkey goes around the angel off to the side into a field, but Balaam, of course, doesn't know what the donkey's doing, so for straying off the path, he starts to beat it with a stick. But then the angel goes on ahead and stands in front of the donkey again, and this time the donkey goes the other side and scrapes Balaam's foot into a wall, so he beats the donkey again, and then it happens a third time, and the donkey can't go left or right, so it crouches down and gets beaten again. And then we come down to, there's a lot of explanation here of the area and so forth. And then we go down to, we're in chapter 22, I think. And And they go into the question of why Balaam seemed to be talking to his donkey like he was talking to a person. But it seems that this was, for a soothsayer, not all that unusual. So take that for what it's worth. But on at this point, it isn't clear really in the translation that the from the original language, it's more clear that the donkey was actually not talking on its own, but was being operated basically like a puppet. So God was talking through the donkey, essentially. It wasn't that the donkey or any other animals really had the ability to talk. It's that they could be operated to do so. And again, the likely reason Balaam didn't think much of this is because he is probably used to it as a soothsayer. And the conversation's actually kind of funny because the donkey's going, well, why are you beating me? And Balaam's like, well, you're making a fool out of me, and I'd kill you if I had a sword because you're, taking me off the path, hurting me and stuff like that. And the donkey's like, well, have I ever done this before? Isn't this, unusual? And he's like, no, you haven't done this before. So he's having this conversation. And the donkey's like, maybe you should think that since I've never done this before and you've had me a long time, that maybe there's some reason instead of just beating me, maybe try to figure out what it is. And as a soothsayer, maybe he should have known. But it's actually kind of a funny conversation. But then finally God lets him see the angel, who says something I think is equally comical. And the angel says, if the donkey hadn't tried to avoid me, I'd have killed you, but let the donkey go. So Balaam, of course, is terrified, and he just gets down on the ground, puts his face on the ground, and hopes nothing bad happens to him anyway. But God just says, look, don't curse Israel. So when you get to chapter 23 in the text, he finally meets up with this king Balak. But though they arrange for the curse to be pronounced, it comes out a blessing. So Balaam goes to speak, but all he can do is pronounce blessings. So the king is pretty exasperated since he apparently already gave him some partial payment, but he decides that the gods, as far as he knew, just the ordinary average run-of-the-mill other nation's god, needed more appeasement, so they try it again in a different place where he can see. Apparently he wasn't able to see where Israel was directly, from where he was the first time, so they move to a different spot where they can overlook the whole group. But it fails again. We can see here in Constable's notes that there are 7 oracles total through chapters 23 and 24. But then we see a key statement that in one of the passages, verse 19, I didn't write down the chapter, but I think we're still in chapter 22 at that point. I'm not sure. But it's where God says God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man being, just another way to say a human, that he should change his mind. And this is a good statement to remember when people claim God is just an exalted man, such as the Mormons say, or that he is like the pagan gods, such as the critics say. God is like, no, I am not a human being. I don't have flesh. This is before the incarnate Christ, so God had no flesh at this point. He could take on flesh if he wanted as a theophany, but God is spirit. And he's not a liar like people are. So the second blessing infuriates Balak, so they try a third time, and again another key statement in verse 9 of the next chapter, which is there are blessings on those who bless Israel and curses on those who curse Israel. And I would have to ask today's anti-Israel Christians especially whether they're willing to take such a risk if they're convinced that modern Israel is not a part of God's plans in any way, because they can't guarantee that the nation is completely fake and fulfills no prophecy. That's a huge risk to take, to curse Israel or to think, oh, this is completely fake because we know how they formed. But the fact is, no other nation of that era, of even as late as the 1st century, all the Canaanites and all those people did not rise again as Israel did for whatever reason. The point is that God predicted it. Not that this is the final ingathering, but we do know from prophecy that they have to be there in their land in unbelief. That's pretty much the state they were in the first century, which is basically what we have right now. So we can't say this is not in God's plans, and we can't hate Jews just because it's fashionable. Anyway, back to the text. Balaam tries 4 times to curse Israel, and he not only kept blessing them, but he also prophesied details about their conquest and, about over the various other nations, and talks about their, exactly who would be defeated and how. And God has shown in this incident that he will even dispense true messages through the ungodly, even an animal. So we have here incidents where a unbeliever and his donkey are speaking true messages from God. So God is all about the message, not the messenger. And if he decides to use someone who doesn't meet our approval, who are we to get in the way? And I'm talking about the issues of prejudice in the church as it's been from most of its history, whether it was against Jews or against blacks or against women, saying you have the wrong kind of flesh, you can't speak for God. Well, God has other plans. I have made up what I call a concise definition of patriarchy that says that God can speak through an animal, a plant, the burning bush, or a rock, as Jesus said the rocks would cry out, but never a woman. And some people would say, or never a black, or never this or that. So God can speak through an animal, a plant, or a rock. He can speak through any human being, regardless of their flesh. And woe to the person who says, no, God's truth can't come through that venue or that mouthpiece. So let's skip ahead here to page 85. And we're looking to chapter 25 here. And it highlights another lesson for us today. Great achievements are often followed by great failures. After all that's happened, Israel's close proximity to Moab leads the men to chase after the heathen women who were also priestesses in the religion of Moab, their pagan gods. And they invited them to their sacrifices, which were wild parties, essentially. And the order of the text is not chronological, we have to remember here. So we have to look ahead to chapter 31 to see that this came at the instigation of Balaam. That's why we're kind of skipped ahead here. The text jumps around because it's arranged more topically than chronologically. And so it was Balaam who gave them this idea. Look, I can't curse Israel, but I can tell you something to do. You can lure them into idolatry. And so, as I said, you'd have to skip ahead to 31 to see that Balaam is the one who did this, and that this is actually what finally worked, that he basically got Israel to curse itself. So God will tell Moses to arrest every leader in Israel who sinned with the Moabites and publicly execute them. But while he was still speaking, one of them brazenly brings a Moabite woman to his tent. But one of the priests grabs a javelin and runs into the tent and impales both of them at once. And God had brought a terrible plague on Israel as a result of all these sins. And this person just, that was the last straw. But because of this plague that had killed like 24,000 people, it stops when this one priest finally has enough and says, this is, we're not tolerating this idolatry. So it isn't, there's more people than just Moses apparently now at this point who are acting on God's behalf and sharing his indignation at these people flaunting their claimed freedom to do whatever they want in front of the God who had just, taken them out of Egypt with many miracles. So they were showing contempt for God, and that's what this one priest just wasn't going to put up with, and God will honor him for that. Now, chapter 26, we have a major section in the outline here. Chapter 26 begins the final phase of Israel's wandering with the second census of men of fighting age, and also to calculate the amount of land for each tribe. So this is the younger generation that is the reason they're taking another census. But when it comes to all of these men being honored and men this and men that, when the a lot of readers would be chalking up another male centric win in all these things. Chapter 27 tells us of 5 women who realize that their clan is about to be robbed of land just because their father left no male heirs. God told Moses that the claim was valid and the women must be granted land. And to this we could also add the fact that Job was granted inheritance to his daughters at the end of the book there, because there's only so far God is going to go to accommodate and compromise with social norms. Injustice is injustice. It doesn't matter who is being wronged. It isn't okay to wrong weaker members of society. So God tells Moses, look, that you can't just have your social norms in this case because it would be unjust. Totally unjust. Yes, slavery was unjust and so forth, but at least the slaves were not being terribly mistreated in Israel, and they were apparently okay with that. I mean, it was accepted. It wasn't something that people were chafing against as they were in Egypt. It wasn't an oppressive slavery. In the same way, at least the women had it better than any of the other nations, and as I've said many times, this is a step, not the whole staircase. So, they take their census, and let's go down to page 91 in the notes here. And we are into chapter 27. And at this point, the text turns to the impending death of Moses. And so God has him go up on Mount Nebo to see the promised land from there that he himself would not be allowed to enter because he struck that rock instead of speaking to it. And he took the news pretty well, but likely partially at least to all the grief he had to endure from Israel, being caught between a rock and a hard place mostly, pun intended. Wasn't having a happy life in spite of the honor that God was giving to him and speaking to him to his face. He still had these Israelites to deal with. And so he probably was, and he was 120, I think, probably tired of living anyway. So, but he takes it well, and he chooses his right-hand man Joshua to succeed him. But instead of continuing on with that right now, the text turns back to the requirements of the feast, and there's a chart of these on page 94, so let's jump ahead to that. Fairly detailed chart of all the different things that they were to do, and these again are things that you would want to be aware of where they are in the Bible when you study Bible prophecy, because a lot of things have to do with Jewish feasts. That's what they pointed to, the future. They were symbolic, just as the snake being held up was symbolic. So we get to page 95 here in chapter 30, and we go back to the topic of vows, and again we see the lesser social, not spiritual, value of women in society. Even so, a woman not viewed as the possession or honor of any particular man was responsible for her own vows. As people will use this as a proof text to say that women have to be under men's thumb. That's not what God is teaching at all. And we should, by the word teaching, remember that at least for Hebrews, the word Torah means instruction, not necessarily just law. And the New Testament, as I've mentioned before, is saying that the Old Testament events are for us to learn from, not to obey, but to learn from. And what we're learning here is not the inferiority of half the human race under the other half. What we're learning is that God is guiding people step by step and keeping limits on human frailty. So when it comes to these vows, again, this is social norms. And even then, God says there's circumstances in which the woman is responsible because she is a human being after all, and she's not a child. A lot of men seem to think that women are something more like children, and this is not the attitude God has. Now, of course, I have to strongly dispute a statement here, this quote, where it says that, I think this is the one where it says that Adam was held responsible for Eve's actions because of his silence. Okay, and I'm not sure that this is the right quote. There's might be down a little bit farther, but yeah, there it is on 96, sorry. Where he's quoting someone as saying, the assumed culpability of Adam in Genesis 3 may stem from the principle behind this law, because she, in 3:6, they say Adam's wife makes a rash decision in his presence. Yes, he was with her, they admit that, but the fact is that he, as not saying anything, was culpable. I agree with them on that, but not because he had some law that said he was responsible for her. There's no such law there. That's not, they're misapplying the laws of Moses back onto Adam. This is an anachronistic fallacy. We've already seen in our study of Genesis that there was no such responsibility or authority existing between Adam and Eve before they left Eden. It just didn't exist. And it's especially inappropriate to compare a parent-child responsibility, as the vow laws we're talking about, with a husband-wife situation, especially this side of the cross, because possession of some humans by others was never God's natural order. God's natural order was seen before the fall, before they left Eden, and so this quote is completely misguided and misapplying Scripture in saying that Adam's silence was any kind of prototype of the laws of Moses. He was silent because he was being cowardly and lazy and shifting blame. That's what the context gives us there. So let's move on now to chapter 31, and that tells us that Moses had one final task to perform. He must see to it that Israel wipes out Midian. Among the slain there will be Balaam, whose clever plan finally catches up with him. And though most people balk at the idea of women and children as plunder, as you can read in that section, it would be more humane than either killing them or leaving them to fend for themselves. So what were they supposed to do? You know, a lot of people don't have problems with men at war killing each other, but what happens to the people of the defeated men? So taking them as plunder is the best case scenario. And again, we cannot use this anachronistic fallacy and apply modern sensibilities to ancient times and cultures. But there's a further complication here. Moses is angry that they failed to kill all the women. He reminds them that these women were the ones who had enticed them to sin, and that's the point that the critics miss. And also the boys would grow up at least to undoubtedly avenge their fathers. So these things had to be considered. And even so, we might accept God wiping out women and children if they had Nephilim blood. A lot of people would use this explanation. But there's nothing in this passage to indicate that this was the reason. It was, as stated, that the women were the ones the Israelite men sinned with, and they were often the priestesses, and their children would grow up to avenge them. So God has his reasons. And they can, the critics can say God is bloodthirsty and cold and vicious, but they ignore the fact that as God, all life is his. That's what all the blood sacrifices were about, the fact that all life has to go back to God. And if we use our lives in ways that defy him, he has the right of vengeance. He is God and we're not. And wouldn't innocent children go to heaven anyway? I think they would. There are some people who disagree, but I think they're way off base, because God isn't a tyrant. So when God took the firstborn of Egypt as vengeance for taking the baby boys of Israel, was that less objectionable? Just because now it's in a case of war and people are acting on God's behalf instead of the angel directly killing the firstborn, no matter how little they were. I mean, what's the difference in principle? If the critics are going to be critics and consistent about it, they would have to have had a problem with God himself doing the killing, as with God delegating it to the state, essentially. And again, they think this is barbaric, but they're forgetting that God, as the giver of life, is also the taker of life. And if he has someone else do it for him, that's his prerogative as God. But the question for critics really is whether or not they have the right to point fingers at God, because if they had the power, as many of them I've heard them say, they would gladly destroy God and all his followers. That's what the Tower of Babel, one of the reasons some speculate that they were building this tower to the sky, is in defiance of God, not only symbolically, but to try to actually, according to some accounts, take this with a grain of salt, to storm heaven and take out God. But the thing is that people today would do the same thing if they had the power. They hate God. It just drips from their every word, typing or spoken, that they claim not to believe in God, but they sure hate him enough to be obsessed and talk more about God than a lot of Christians do, because they hate him, even though they think he's non-existent. They just hate him. And the thing is that they would do what they say God should not do. And the reason they say they hate him for killing, they would gladly kill him and all his followers. I mean, this happens today, that followers of Jesus are killed. So who are they to point fingers? They would do the same thing. They hate Israel. They hate Christians. They would gladly wipe us all out if they had the power. And we know from Bible prophecy that the world will gladly do this, put people to death, or gladly watch the public hangings, or what actually they'll be beheadings, as far as we can tell, or being starved because they don't take the mark of the beast. And any other form of atrocity, they will be happy to see Christians and Jews mistreated, tortured, robbed, starved, and beheaded. They will gladly do this while still pointing fingers at God and hating him for being God. And even now they condone this violence, any kind of violence against others, just for purely ideological differences. And they turn a blind eye to the suffering and death of millions that they simply don't like. We see this politically. There are people, they call them the Antifa in the U.S. here, that are actually the fascists, because they are instigating and performing violent acts against people who simply don't agree with their political views. This is what people are like, and yet again they hypocritically turn to God and say, you shouldn't have killed those children, or you shouldn't have done this and that. Especially with the children, anybody who is pro-abortion is an absolute utter hypocrite if they criticize God for having Israel put children to death. Because they do it every day, and they don't even care. They don't care about abortion. Out of sight, out of mind. But if God does something, oh, this is terrible. God is bad. God is evil. But they do the same things and think that they are righteous in doing so. So they're just hypocrites. And this very Israel that we've been reading about is a nation many have desired to wipe off the map in total. I mean, everywhere in the world, but especially in Israel, they want them off the map. So who are these critics to judge God? That's the point, is their hypocrisy. Now let's go back, go forward rather to page 102 on Constable's Notes, and we're up to chapters 33 through 36, where Moses gives a lot of last minute business to take care of, and especially after chapter 31, things have changed kind of around there. But there's one more point worth mentioning in 35, just before this. Well, it's actually in this section, but they did an introductory, then went back to chapter 33, and then eventually they have another map here of their travels and where all these different ites were living. But in chapter 35, God will require at least 2 witnesses to convict anyone of a crime worthy of death. This is where we get the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So how often, though, do we as Christians, another lesson for us, how often do we as Christians quickly condemn someone on the basis of nothing but one person's claims, or worse, by nothing but suspicion or personal dislike? We have to remember what Jesus said about being judged by the standards we used to judge others. So if we go around condemning people just because they have one certain belief we don't like, or we don't like their personality or their methods, or we just suspect because of what somebody said that this person might do something else, basically the idea of pre-crime, if you are familiar with the movie whose name just left my head, I can't remember it right now, Minority Report. Pre-crime, where people were arrested for something these seers said that they were about to do. Well, it's even worse than that, because these people don't even have psychic ability. They just assume that they know what a person will do, and they're going to stop it from happening, and judge and condemn them on the basis of something they just suspected because they don't like a person. So Christians especially need to be careful about this, because that's how God is going to judge us. And there will be a judgment, the Bema Seat judgment, where we will be judged, as Paul put it, for deeds done in the body, good or bad. It isn't just an award ceremony. So if we don't want people, we don't want God to condemn us on the basis of just suspicions and things we never did but might have done, then we better not do that to each other. And then the text goes back to land grants, and you can see here what was promised, and we've gone over that before in other lessons, and what they actually got at first was a very small, tiny area on the Mediterranean. But the thing is that God's dealings with Israel were and always will be, as long as the earth remains, about a people, a land, and a covenant. The ultimate fulfillment was in Christ. And yes, eternity future is spiritual and immortal, but it will also be physical. The new heavens and new earth, read in the later chapters of Revelation, the old heaven and earth will be thrown away and burned up and destroyed, and then we'll get a new one, and then there will be this new Jerusalem coming down out of the sky, and the new earth will not have any seas and so forth. You can read the description, but it's still physical places, as far as anyone can tell. So we know that there's a millennium, according to prophecy, where it will be still on the old earth during the millennium. So we have at least 1,000 years remaining for this earth, and we in the body of Christ can't rush God's plans or tell him they're already completed. So I say all this to make the point again that there are plans that have not been finished yet for Israel, that God made promises that cannot be revoked, and he made them about physical things on this earth to people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then to the whole nation. And so we can't ignore these things. And this passage and all the others of the books so far of the Old Testament are things we need to be familiar with, at least, so when we study later things, we know what they're talking about. So that's pretty much the gist of the book of Numbers. And as I've said before, you can go through these notes yourself and get a lot more detail about cities of refuge and so forth, how they were dealing with day-to-day life as a nation. This is a theocracy, and that means that there's also civic laws, religious laws, etc., and interpersonal laws. So people are remiss in misapplying scriptures, in my opinion, if they don't recognize the context and the literalness of God's promises, the covenants, as mentioned in one of the introductory lessons. And as Constable closes out here, he says the book of Numbers is a lesson in the importance of trust and obedience. And Israel repeatedly failed, but God never abandoned them. And why people think that just because Israel was destroyed in AD 70, that God is never going to go back to them again just because that's after Jesus came, they don't know their scriptures when they say these things. Because why do they think that God is done with the nation when he's never been done with them before because of their sins, and they were scattered because of their sins and their rejection of him? But as the New Testament assures us in several places, that God will return and restore Israel on this earth, physically, in that land. So, as Constable's noting down here, the book teaches us that God's chosen instruments do not frustrate his plans. Okay, they can delay them or sidetrack them, but they will come back and God's promises will be carried out. And there's a quote here that perhaps the most important, prominent theme is that the gracious providence of the Lord in caring for all of Israel's needs in every way, in spite of their constant rebellion. So, and as they point out there, the leadership and the rank and file. It isn't just, even Moses and Aaron were forbidden, and Miriam were forbidden from entering the promised land. So prominent, yes, they were, and blessed by God, certainly, and so was the whole nation, but that doesn't mean there are no consequences for misbehaving. So, as they say here in this the main paragraph, everything depends on one's attitude toward God. If we allow the giants and walls that stand between ourselves and God's will to block our view of God, we will fail. Unbelief will lead to disobedience, that will lead to discipline, that will lead to frustration and death. However, if we see the giants and walls overshadowed by God, as Caleb and Joshua did, we will succeed. Trust will lead to obedience, that will lead to blessing, that will lead to progress in life. So that's the point of Numbers, and really the whole time from Abraham to the end of Moses' life. And there's a lot of lessons we've been able to pick out from these things. So the important thing is whether we're going to be better than Israel. We point our fingers at them, but we do the same things and worse because of our vantage point in history. We can look back and learn all these lessons, but we don't learn them either, any more than Israel learned lessons. And we don't suffer their curses because we're not in this contract, this covenant, and yet we expect, a lot of people, especially in the Hebrew Roots movement, expect God's blessings to Israel to apply to them while they ignore Israel's curses. So the point is that God has reasons for doing things, and we either trust him or we don't. And if we trust him, things will go well because all the blessings came from him in the first place, and so he withdraws those if we show by our actions that we really don't want him to be our God. So that's the lesson from all this, and next time we will go on to the last book of the Torah, or Pentateuch. That would be Deuteronomy.